There's a costume shop in our town, but not the kind you'd expect. It shows up once a year, always the week before Halloween, and by the time November rolls around, it's gone without a trace. No flyers, no advertisements, just a building at the end of Clover Street that wasn't there the week before. Locals call it the Masquerade. No one really knows where it comes from or who runs it. But the costumes, well, they're unlike anything you'll find anywhere else. Realistic, detailed, almost unsettlingly lifelike. The kind of thing that makes you think, maybe, just maybe, the masks are staring back at you. I've been going there for the past 3 years. I'm not superstitious like some of the others in town who refuse to set foot near it. They say there's something wrong with the place, that anyone who walks in comes out different. That's just small-town paranoia, though. I'd never had a problem before. Just good, fun Halloween costumes that got me a few compliments at parties. Nothing more. But this year, something changed. The rules. They were always simple. Pick one costume. Don't change it until Halloween's over. And for God's sake, don't try to modify it. Easy enough, right? I never had a reason to question them. Not until I noticed what happened to the people who didn't follow through. It started a couple of weeks ago. I was sitting at home, flipping through Netflix, when I got a text from Sarah. She's my best friend. Has been since high school. We're both 27 now. Living in the same town we grew up in, still doing the same old things. Sarah's the type who loves Halloween as much as I do, maybe more. She's always been a little eccentric, with her dyed purple hair, thick-rimmed glasses, and that sarcastic smile that never quite leaves her face. I guess you could say we bonded over a shared love of all things weird and spooky. The text was short. "The shop's back. You going this year?" I stared at the message for a second before typing back. "Of course. Want to meet up tomorrow?" She sent a thumbs-up emoji, and that was that. I didn't think much of it. We'd been going to the Masquerade together for years, and it had become a kind of tradition. We'd walk in, browse the bizarre assortment of costumes, and pick out something outrageous to wear. Sarah would always go for something ironic. Last year, she went as a sexy librarian, and somehow pulled it off. Me? I leaned into the horror vibe. One year, I was a blood-soaked zombie bride. The next, a Victorian ghost. The next day, we met up around noon. Clover Street is tucked away near the outskirts of town, just a little off the main road. You wouldn't notice it if you weren't looking. Sarah was already there when I arrived, leaning against the faded brick wall of a cafe across the street from the shop. She had her usual leather jacket on, paired with skinny jeans and ankle boots, a combination that never failed to give off that effortless, edgy look. "Thought you'd chicken out this year," she said with a smirk as I walked up. "Like hell," I replied. "I've got plans for a killer costume." Sarah glanced across the street at the shop. "You think the rumors are true?" I raised an eyebrow. "What rumors?" "People say there's been more rules this year, that they're getting stricter." I laughed it off. "We've been going for 3 years, Sarah. We know the drill. Pick a costume, wear it, and don't mess with it. Easy." She didn't seem convinced. "I heard Jake McAllister never came back last year." I rolled my eyes. Jake was known for ghosting on parties, not some dark, mysterious Halloween curse. But there was something in her tone that felt off. Sarah didn't buy into gossip. She wasn't the type to let fear or rumors dictate her choices. Yet there she was, standing outside the shop, hesitating. I brushed it off. "Come on," I nudged her. "You're not backing out now, are you?" She gave me a half-hearted smile and shook her head. "No, I'm not. Let's go." The door to the masquerade creaked open with that familiar sound, like it had been sealed shut for a century and was reluctantly letting us in. The shop smelled the same as always, a strange mix of incense and dust. The lighting inside was dim, casting everything in a warm, amber glow. Racks of costumes lined the walls, from Victorian dresses to elaborate monster masks, each one more detailed than the last. Behind the counter stood the owner, a tall, thin man with slicked back hair and piercing blue eyes. I'd never caught his name, and I wasn't sure anyone had. He always looked the same, ageless, as if time didn't touch him. He nodded in our direction as we entered, but said nothing. That was part of the shop's charm, I guess. You never had to make small talk. You just walked in, chose your costume, and left. Sarah wandered off to the left, gravitating toward the more humorous selections as always. I headed to the right, where the darker, more dramatic costumes were. There were no prices. There never were. You just found what you liked, and somehow it worked out. This year, something caught my eye almost immediately. It was hanging in the corner, draped in heavy black fabric. A figure, tall and imposing, with a mask that was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was porcelain white, with delicate cracks running through it, like a shattered mirror trying to hold itself together. The eyes were hollow, and the mouth was twisted into a faint, haunting smile. It wasn't a ghost, or a monster, or anything I could place. It was just wrong. But I couldn't look away. I walked over and lifted the costume off the rack. The fabric was heavy, soft, but cold to the touch, and it came with a full-length cloak. I checked the tag. No name, no description. Just Rule 1. Do not remove the mask until sunrise. I hesitated, then called over to Sarah. Hey, what do you think of this one? She came over, raising an eyebrow. Creepy as hell, but it suits you. I think I'm going to go with it, I said, grinning. It felt right. Strange, but right. We walked up to the counter, and the man behind it didn't say a word as I laid the costume down. He just watched, those piercing eyes seeming to study me in a way that made my skin crawl. He tapped a small card beside the register. Rules. 1. Do not remove the mask until sunrise. 2. Do not modify the costume. 3. Do not discuss the costume shop with anyone. I took the card, glanced at it, then shoved it into my pocket. Easy enough, I thought. But as Sarah and I left the shop, I couldn't shake the feeling that this year I'd just made a mistake. I spent the next couple of days thinking about the costume more than I'd expected. There was something about it that lingered in the back of my mind, like a half-remembered dream that won't let go. Maybe it was the weight of the mask in my hands, or the unsettling rules that came with it. But it wasn't just that. The masquerade had never felt so tense before. There was always an air of mystery, sure, but this time was different. The shop owner's silent stare, the extra rules. Things felt off. Halloween was approaching fast, and I still hadn't tried the costume on. Every time I went to take it out of the closet, something stopped me. A hesitation. Maybe a gut feeling. I brushed it off as nerves or some subconscious holdover from the creepy vibes of the shop. After all, I wasn't a stranger to unsettling things. Growing up, I had always been drawn to the macabre. My mom used to say I had a spooky streak, which is probably why I ended up working at a small horror prop company straight out of college. The kind of job that barely paid the bills but let me be creative with all things gory and weird. Fake blood, animatronic monsters, latex masks. I could make those with my eyes closed. The costume shop didn't scare me, not really. But this year, something about the whole thing felt different. It felt personal. I hadn't told Sarah this, but my dad had always been one for rules. Strict ones. Growing up, the house felt like it operated under an unspoken rule book of his design. A kind of silent dictatorship. He was the kind of man who believed in discipline above all, who thought emotions were messy and inconvenient. "Follow the rules and you won't have a problem," he used to say. I remember the way his voice would cut through the room like a judge's gavel, final and unforgiving. It left me feeling like I was constantly on edge, walking through life as though one wrong step would land me in some kind of trouble I could never quite name. That's why I left as soon as I could. I hadn't spoken to him in years. Funny how a few lines scribbled on a piece of paper in a Halloween shop could drag all that back to the surface. Do not remove the mask until sunrise. Do not modify the costume. Do not discuss the costume shop with anyone. Stupid rules, I thought. But they reminded me of him. Sarah, of course, had already texted me twice since we'd left the shop. She was excited about her costume, some kind of medieval knight getup, complete with a cardboard shield she'd probably paint something ridiculous on. She was like that, always making fun out of anything. Her excitement was infectious. It always had been. We'd gone through a lot together, she and I. High school, college, crappy jobs, breakups, the works. She was the closest thing I had to family now, ever since my mom passed and my dad had become, well, a ghost, I guess. I was just about to respond to Sarah when my phone rang. I checked the screen. An unknown number. I usually ignored those, assuming it was spam or a scam call, but for some reason, I answered. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end. I almost hung up, thinking it was a bad connection, when I heard breathing. Shallow, deliberate, and then a voice. Low and scratchy, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. "You're wearing it, aren't you?" I froze, gripping the phone a little tighter. "Who is this?" "Don't break the rules," the voice said, slow and deliberate, "or it'll break you." I pulled the phone away, staring at it in confusion before quickly hanging up. My heart was racing, but I tried to shake it off as some prank. Maybe the shop owner had a weird sense of humor, or maybe Sarah had put someone up to it. She loved messing with me. I didn't tell her about the call. Instead, I texted back something about meeting up later for the Halloween party we'd been planning on going to. There wasn't much time left before the big night, and I still needed to get my costume sorted out. Halloween morning arrived faster than I expected. It was a crisp, late October day, and the leaves had started piling up in the streets, creating that familiar scent of autumn decay. Sarah and I had agreed to meet at her place before the party, but something about the day felt off. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the costume hanging in the corner of my room. I'd been avoiding it for days, and now it was time to face it. I walked over and ran my fingers over the cloak's fabric. It was cold, just like I remembered. The mask, with its porcelain cracks and unnerving smile, sat on my dresser, propped up against the mirror. Its hollow eyes seemed to follow me. With a deep breath, I pulled the costume off the hanger and started dressing. The cloak was heavy, almost suffocating, but it fit perfectly. As I picked up the mask, something about it seemed to pulse in my hands, like it had its own heartbeat. My fingers hesitated at the edges of it, but I had no choice. Rules were rules. I slipped it over my face. For a moment, nothing happened. I looked at myself in the mirror. The mask was eerie, sure, but it fit well, and the costume as a whole looked impressive. But then, as I stood there staring at my reflection, I felt strange. It was like a subtle pressure, a tightness in my chest. My breath became shallow, and I suddenly realized how hard it was to breathe through the mask. I reached up to pull it off. Don't remove the mask until sunrise. The rule flashed in my mind, clear and sharp. I stopped myself just in time, lowering my hands back to my sides. Was this what the shop's owner had meant? Why the rules were so strict this year? I shook my head, trying to clear the growing unease. I wasn't going to let a stupid mask get to me. Grabbing my keys, I headed out the door to Sarah's, trying to push the weirdness to the back of my mind. It was Halloween after all, time for fun, time to celebrate. But as I walked down the empty street, each step seemed to echo in my ears, and with every second that passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mask was getting tighter, or that it was becoming harder to remember what my face looked like underneath. Sarah's place was only a short walk from mine, but today it felt longer. The costume's cloak, heavy as it was, weighed down on my shoulders, and the mask seemed to press against my face, as if it had been molded directly to my skin. My breath felt warm and trapped inside the mask, and the hollow eye holes distorted my peripheral vision, making the world seem just a little off-kilter. But I couldn't take it off. Not yet. Do not remove the mask until sunrise. It was just a rule. I could handle that, right? Sarah lived in a small, cozy apartment just off Maple Street, and by the time I reached her door, I was already feeling a little claustrophobic. I could hear her inside, laughing with the usual group. Our Halloween tradition wasn't just about us. We had a small circle of friends who'd join us every year. This time, it would be the same group as always. Chris, with his goofy, lovable attitude, Jenny, who loved to take things way too seriously, and Matt, who always dressed as the most inappropriate characters possible just for the laughs. I knocked once, and the door swung open almost immediately. Sarah, already in her night costume, stood there grinning like a kid who had just won the lottery. Her armor, which was clearly pieced together from various thrift store finds, clinked as she moved aside to let me in. "Nice getup," she said, her eyes flicking up and down my costume. "Seriously, that mask is creepy as hell. Where'd you find that?" "At the shop," I mumbled through the mask, my voice slightly muffled. "Obviously," she shot back, grinning. "You always pick the freaky stuff. Come on, the others are here." I stepped inside, the warmth of her apartment immediately making me aware of just how suffocating the mask was. I wanted to pull it off, just for a second, to get some air, but I couldn't. Not yet. The others were scattered around the living room, drinks already in hand. Chris, dressed as a pirate with a comically oversized hat, waved as I walked in. "About time. We were starting to think you got lost in that thing." "More like swallowed by it," Jenny added, giving me a once-over. She was in some sort of elaborate cat costume, probably a nod to her obsession with those Instagram-famous cats she was always talking about. Matt was the last to acknowledge me, giving a slow whistle from where he was sprawled on the couch. He was, as expected, dressed as a zombie clown. Typical Matt. "Damn, dude, that's intense. You look like you belong in a horror movie." I forced a laugh, but the truth was, I felt strange. The mask was tight. Too tight. And there was a dull, persistent throbbing at the back of my skull that wasn't there before. Still, I wasn't about to let it ruin the night. I could handle this. I'd been through worse. We all sat around, joking, drinking, and making fun of each other's costumes. But I found myself distracted. It was harder to focus, harder to laugh, harder to feel like myself. I kept adjusting the mask, trying to find some relief from the way it seemed to cling to my skin. But nothing helped. Sarah caught me fidgeting a few times and gave me a curious look. "You okay?" she asked, leaning closer as the others started up some ridiculous debate over who had the better costume. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, forcing another smile she probably couldn't see under the mask. This thing's a little uncomfortable. You could take it off for a bit, she suggested, her tone light. We're not at the party yet. No one here cares. I shook my head, the words from the shop echoing in my mind. Do not remove the mask until sunrise. Can't. Part of the costume, I guess. Sarah frowned, clearly not understanding why I was sticking so strictly to the rules, but she didn't push it. All right, but seriously, let me know if you start, passing out or something. I nodded, but I could tell she was still watching me closely as the night wore on. Chris, Matt, and Jenny were all too engrossed in the usual banter to notice anything was wrong. I wanted to join in, to be a part of the fun like I always was, but I just couldn't. The mask was distracting me, pulling at me. It was like I could feel it growing tighter, not just on my face, but inside my head, like it was digging into my thoughts. At some point, the conversation shifted toward the masquerade itself. Chris, with a slightly tipsy grin, turned to me. "So, you really got that thing from that shop, huh? The one that just pops up every Halloween?" "Yeah," I muttered. "I've heard some weird stories about that place," Jenny said, sipping her drink thoughtfully. "Like, there are people who went in there years ago and were never seen again. It's all over Reddit." "Oh, please." Sarah rolled her eyes, though there was a hint of discomfort in her voice. "It's just a store. Creepy as hell, sure, but it's not, cursed or anything." "I don't know." Matt chimed in, lazily waving his arm. "Every town's got a place like that. The spooky shop or weird house everyone's too scared to go near. Just look at this dude." He pointed at me. "He's practically possessed by that mask." Everyone laughed, but I didn't. The joke hit a little too close to home. The mask felt heavy, oppressive. It was hard to breathe, and no matter how many times I shifted or adjusted it, nothing seemed to help. "Hey, you sure you're all right?" Sarah asked again, her voice more serious this time. I nodded, though the movement felt slow, almost unnatural. "Yeah," I said, but it came out wrong. It wasn't me. The words felt like they were being pulled from somewhere else, as if they weren't my own. Sarah studied me for a second, clearly not convinced, but before she could say anything else, the others were already getting up to head to the party. I stood with them, my legs feeling weak beneath me, but I forced myself to move. I can get through this, I thought. It's just a mask. But as we stepped out into the chilly October night, I realized that something had changed. The mask was no longer just tight. It was fused to my skin. The line between where the porcelain ended and my flesh began had blurred. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Panic surged in my chest, but I couldn't show it. Not yet. I had to keep the rules, had to play along. Sunrise wasn't that far away, I told myself. I just had to make it through the night. As we walked down the street toward the party, I felt something inside me shift, a low, cold whisper, faint but growing louder, and it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the mask. The walk to the party felt like a march toward something I wasn't ready for. The mask, heavy and suffocating, seemed to pulse with every step I took, a dull pressure building behind my eyes. It wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It felt like the mask was slowly becoming a part of me, melding into my skin in a way I couldn't explain. Every time I moved, the mask moved with me, as if it had always been there. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on Sarah and the others, but my thoughts were clouded by an eerie, creeping sensation I couldn't shake. The party was at Chris's friend's house, a big old Victorian on the edge of town that looked like something out of a horror movie set. The yard was decked out with fake tombstones, cobwebs, and plastic skeletons hanging from the trees. The windows glowed with a warm, flickering light, and muffled music thumped from inside. As we walked up to the door, Sarah nudged me with her elbow. "You sure you're good? You've been pretty quiet." I gave her a thumbs up, though I wasn't sure why I bothered. Inside, I didn't feel good. I didn't feel like myself at all. But I couldn't say that, couldn't admit how deeply the mask was messing with me. The rule was clear. Do not remove the mask until sunrise. Chris rang the doorbell, and a moment later, the door swung open. Loud music and the smell of cheap beer and pizza hit us all at once. The party was already in full swing. People in costumes milled about, dancing, drinking, and talking loudly over the music. It should have been fun. It should have been like every other Halloween party we'd ever gone to. But as soon as I stepped inside, the air shifted. It felt denser, heavier, as if the whole house was pressing in on me. I glanced around the room, scanning the crowd. Everyone was laughing, shouting, having a great time. But something felt off. And it wasn't just the mask. It was the way people moved, the way they looked at me. For a second, I swore their faces were distorted, twisted into grotesque versions of themselves, just for a flash, but long enough to make me shiver. I turned to Sarah. She was already halfway to the kitchen, waving for me to follow. "Come on, let's get a drink," she shouted over the music. I hesitated, but then forced myself to move, following her into the crowded kitchen. There were bowls of candy, snacks, and an ungodly amount of cheap alcohol spread across the counters. Sarah grabbed a cup, filled it with something bright red, and handed it to me. "Here, this'll loosen you up." I took the cup but didn't drink. I couldn't. The mask covered my mouth completely, and the thought of lifting it, even just a little, sent a wave of panic through me. Do not remove the mask until sunrise. Sarah didn't seem to notice. She was already chatting with someone from work, laughing and gesturing wildly as if nothing was wrong. But for me, everything was wrong. The noise, the heat, the way the mask pressed tighter and tighter against my face. I could barely breathe. The room felt like it was closing in. I needed air. "I'll be right back," I muttered, but my voice was barely audible beneath the mask. I didn't even wait for Sarah's response. I pushed my way through the crowd, heading toward the back door that led to the yard. The night air hit me like a wave of relief, cool and crisp against my skin. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself down. My heart was racing, my thoughts spinning in a dizzying spiral of confusion and fear. What was happening to me? I reached up, fingers brushing the edge of the mask. I wanted so badly to tear it off, to feel the cool air on my face, but I couldn't. The rules were the only thing keeping me grounded. Do not remove the mask until sunrise. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. The back door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. It wasn't Sarah or anyone from our group. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in a simple black suit. His face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his eyes were dark, sunken pits that seemed to swallow the light. He moved slowly, deliberately, and as he approached, a chill ran down my spine. "You're one of them," he said softly, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He was just watching. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. "One of who?" I asked, though the mask made my voice sound distant and warped. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering his answer. "One of the chosen, one of the marked." He took another step closer, his eyes fixed on mine, though I couldn't tell if he was looking at me or at the mask. "You found the shop, and now the shop has found you." A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. "What are you talking about?" He stopped, standing just a few feet away from me. "The mask," he said softly. "You haven't tried to remove it yet, have you?" I shook my head, though every instinct screamed at me to pull it off and run. "No," I whispered. "I can't." "Good," he said, his tone almost approving. "That means there's still time. But be careful. There are others who would tempt you, others who don't want you to follow the rules." "What do you mean, others?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happens if I break the rules?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn card. He held it out to me, his hand trembling slightly. I hesitated for a moment before taking it. The card was old, yellowed with age, and the edges were frayed. On it, written in faded ink, were the same rules I'd seen in the shop. 1. Do not remove the mask until sunrise. 2. Do not modify the costume. 3. Do not discuss the costume shop with anyone. I stared at the card, my mind racing. Why was he showing this to me? How did he know about the shop? Before I could ask, the man stepped back, his dark eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Remember the rules," he said quietly. "They're all that's keeping you safe." And then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the house, disappearing into the crowd as if he'd never been there at all. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the card in my hand. My heart was pounding, my skin clammy beneath the mask. Safe? The rules were keeping me safe? From what? I slipped the card into my pocket and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. And I wasn't sure the rules were enough to protect me. After the man disappeared, I stood outside for what felt like an eternity, staring blankly into the shadows that seemed to stretch forever in the dim backyard. My fingers absently touched the pocket where the card now rested, the worn edges of the paper reminding me of the cryptic words I'd just heard. "You found the shop. Now the shop has found you." It didn't make sense. None of it did. Who was that man? How did he know about the rules? And what did he mean by others? The questions swirled in my head, but no answers came. All I knew was that the mask felt heavier, tighter, like it was closing in on me, crushing me under its weight. My breath came shallow and quick, but I forced myself to calm down. I couldn't lose it now. I couldn't let the panic take over. I was about to turn and go back inside when the door creaked open again. This time it was Sarah. She stepped out, her night costume clinking softly as she approached, concern etched across her face. "You've been out here a while," she said. "What's going on?" I hesitated. I wanted to tell her everything. The strange man, the rules, the way the mask felt like it was becoming a part of me. But I stopped myself. Do not discuss the costume shop with anyone. "I'm fine," I said, my voice a little too quick. Just needed some air. She didn't seem convinced. Her eyes narrowed slightly and she stepped closer, reaching out to touch my arm. You don't look fine. If something's wrong, you can tell me. I almost did. The words were on the tip of my tongue. But as soon as I opened my mouth, a sharp pain shot through my head, like a needle being driven straight into my skull. I winced, gripping my head with one hand, while my other hand instinctively went to the mask. I wanted to rip it off, to pull it away and feel the cool night air on my skin. But the rule stopped me. Do not remove the mask until sunrise. Sarah took a step back, concern turning to alarm. Hey, are you okay? Maybe you should sit down or... I said I'm fine. I snapped, the words harsher than I intended. She recoiled slightly, and I immediately regretted it. But the pain was still there, dull and throbbing at the base of my skull, and I couldn't think clearly. I just need to get through tonight. I'll be fine by morning. Sarah didn't say anything for a moment. She just stared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. All right, if you say so, but don't push yourself too hard, okay? If you need to leave, we'll go. The party isn't that important. I nodded, though I could see the worry still written on her face. She wasn't going to push it, but she wasn't happy either. I felt a pang of guilt, but there was nothing I could do. I had to follow the rules. I couldn't let her get involved. Let's head back inside, she said after a long pause. You'll feel better once you're around everyone again. I wasn't so sure, but I followed her anyway. As we re-entered the house, the noise and heat hit me like a wall, the party now in full swing. People were dancing, shouting, laughing, all of it blurring together into a cacophony of sound that seemed to echo in my head. I felt like I was underwater, everything muffled and distant, while the mask pressed harder against my face. The others didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. Chris was still making jokes with Jenny, and Matt had found a group of people to show off his ridiculous zombie clown outfit. Sarah stuck close to me, though, casting worried glances my way every few minutes. I tried to act normal, tried to smile, but it felt forced. The mask was suffocating, and my skin burned underneath it, as if the porcelain was sinking into my flesh. An hour passed, maybe more. Time felt strange, slipping away without me noticing. The pressure in my head grew worse, and every now and then I caught flashes, distorted faces, dark figures at the edges of my vision, things that shouldn't have been there. I couldn't tell if they were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I leaned in toward Sarah and whispered, I think I need to go. She didn't hesitate. I'll come with you. I shook my head. No, stay. Enjoy the party. I'll be fine once I get home. Are you sure? She looked at me, her eyes full of doubt. I'm sure, I said, though I didn't feel sure at all. I just wanted to get out of there, away from the noise, the heat, the crushing weight of the mask. I'll text you when I get home. She hesitated, but then nodded. All right, but if you don't, I'm calling the cops or something. I'm serious. I managed a weak smile, even though my head felt like it was splitting in two. Deal. With that, I slipped out of the house and into the cool night air, my heart pounding in my chest. I made my way down the street, the darkness closing in around me as the sounds of the party faded behind me. My hands trembled at my sides, and the mask felt heavier with every step I took. The world seemed to tilt, like I was walking through a dream or a nightmare. I barely noticed when the stranger appeared again. He was waiting for me, standing at the corner of the street, his pale face illuminated by the dim glow of a street lamp. His eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto mine as I approached. "You're running out of time," he said softly. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse racing. "What do you mean?" "The mask," he whispered, taking a step closer. "It's already begun. You feel it, don't you? The way it clings to you, the way it pulls at you." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what he meant. The mask wasn't just on me anymore. It was in me. I could feel it, deep beneath my skin, twisting, changing something inside me. "You need to follow the rules," the man said, his voice low and urgent. "Do not remove the mask until sunrise. Do not break the rules no matter what you hear, no matter what you see." "What happens if I do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His eyes seemed to darken, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker across his face. "If you break the rules," he said slowly, "there will be nothing left of you." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. Nothing left of me. Was that what was happening? Was the mask consuming me, bit by bit? I wanted to ask more, but before I could, the man turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone on the empty street. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the shadows where he had been. The cool night air did little to calm the fire burning beneath my skin, and the mask felt tighter than ever, its porcelain surface digging into my flesh. I had to get home. I had to get through the night. But as I started walking again, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how fast I moved, I wasn't going to outrun the thing that had already started to change me. By the time I reached my apartment, the world felt like it had tilted on its axis. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting everything in an unsettling orange glow, but none of it felt real. It was as if I were moving through a dream, one where the edges of reality were blurred and shifting. The mask seemed to grow heavier with every step, pulling at my face, merging deeper with my skin. I could feel it now, something under the surface, something crawling through my veins, whispering at the back of my mind. I fumbled with my keys, finally unlocking the door and stumbling inside. The moment I closed the door behind me, I collapsed onto the couch, gasping for air. The mask was suffocating. I could barely breathe. My chest tightened with each inhale, and I felt a rising panic in my throat. I needed to rip it off. But I couldn't. The rule burned in my mind like a brand. Do not remove the mask until sunrise. Sunrise. How far away was it? I glanced at the clock on the wall, but my vision blurred as I tried to focus on the hands. I couldn't tell anymore. Time felt elastic, stretching and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. Hours, minutes, seconds. None of it mattered. All that mattered was getting through the night. The voice started again. At first it was soft, barely audible, a whisper threading through my thoughts. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, clearer. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside me, somewhere deep beneath the surface of my mind. Take it off. Just take it off. You can't breathe. You're suffocating. I pressed my hands to the mask, fingers trembling as they brushed over the cold porcelain. The temptation to pull it off was overwhelming. I could feel my heart racing, my pulse hammering in my ears, The pressure in my skull built, pulsing with each heartbeat, until it felt like my head was going to split open. I couldn't stand it. I needed to get the mask off. Just for a second. Just enough to catch my breath. Do not remove the mask until sunrise. The rule was like an iron chain wrapped around my mind, holding me in place. But the voice was stronger now, more insistent. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was screaming, clawing at the inside of my head, demanding that I break the rule, that I pull the mask off and breathe. Just take it off. You'll die if you don't. I stood up, stumbling toward the bathroom. Maybe if I splashed some water on my face, I'd calm down. Maybe it would drown out the voice, silence the growing pressure in my mind. I could make it through the night. I had to make it through the night. I flipped the bathroom light on, staring at myself in the mirror. The mask. It was worse than I'd thought. The porcelain had fused to my skin, the cracks spreading out from the edges, spiderwebbing across my face and down my neck. The eye holes seemed smaller now, tighter, as if they were closing in, and my lips, what little I could see of them beneath the mask, were pale, drained of color. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. The mask had become me, or maybe I had become it. I stumbled back, hitting the wall hard enough to send a jolt of pain down my spine. I couldn't let this happen. I had to hold on. I had to stay me. But the voice wouldn't stop. It clawed at me, louder and louder, until I could hear nothing else. Take it off. Take it off. Take it off. I grabbed the edges of the mask, my fingers slipping over the cracked porcelain. For a moment, I almost pulled it off. I was so close. Just one tug, one moment of relief, and it would all be over. I could breathe again. I could be free of it. But something stopped me. A sound. Soft at first, but growing louder. A steady, rhythmic ticking. I froze, hands still gripping the mask. The sound wasn't coming from the apartment. It was coming from inside the mask. A slow, deliberate ticking, like a clock counting down the seconds. And then, beneath the ticking, a voice, different from the one in my head. This one was outside, faint but real. "Don't," it whispered. "Don't do it." The stranger's voice. The man from the party. The one who had warned me. I stumbled back from the mirror, letting go of the mask. My heart was pounding, my head spinning, but I forced myself to focus. I can't take it off. I repeated it like a mantra. I can't break the rule. The voice inside me screamed in protest, but I pushed it down, choking it out with every ounce of willpower I had left. The ticking swelled, expanding through the room and echoing in my mind, growing more insistent with every passing second. I could sense that time was slipping away, though I couldn't explain how. The mask was pressing against me, tugging at me, urging me to break the rules. I knew that if I gave in, if I dared to remove it, I would lose everything. Yet if I could endure, if I could somehow hold out until the first light of dawn, there was a chance, just a small, fragile chance that I might survive. The ticking became unbearable. It echoed through the apartment, the bathroom, my skull. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. Nothing helped. It was everywhere, drowning me, suffocating me. I collapsed onto the floor, curled into a ball, gasping for breath as the world spun around me. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Silence. Complete, deafening silence. I opened my eyes slowly, heart still racing. The ticking was gone. The voice was gone. The pressure in my head had lifted, just enough for me to breathe again. I looked up at the window. The faintest glimmer of light was seeping in through the blinds. Sunrise. I had made it. I reached up, fingers trembling as they touched the edges of the mask. It felt different now, lighter, looser. Slowly, carefully, I pulled at the edges. It gave way easily, almost too easily, as if it were ready to be removed. I lifted it off my face, gasping as the cool air hit my skin for the first time in what felt like an eternity. I dropped the mask onto the floor and stumbled to my feet, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face. It was still there. No cracks, no porcelain. Just me, exhausted, pale, but me. I let out a long, shaky breath and turned toward the door. I needed to get out of here, needed to find Sarah, needed to... I froze. There, on the floor where I had dropped the mask, was another card. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it lay there, as if it had always been there, waiting for me to see it. I bent down, picked it up with trembling hands, and read the message. Congratulations. You followed the rules. You survived. But at the bottom, in small, faded print, was one final sentence. The next rule will be harder.